Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're going to wait a few minutes as more folks join, and we will probably get started in about 2 minutes. Thanks for being here this morning. Right, it is 2 minutes after the half hour. I think we will get started. Just a few things before we get going. This meeting is going to be recorded. We will post it online for others that weren't able to make it, as well as those that are attending to review later. I'll make sure to send out any links and materials as well afterward. So if I go real quickly and go through a pretty detailed slide and you want to know more, you want to revisit it, you'll get a chance afterward. I'll also say that if you have any questions at any point during the presentation, you can either use the hand raise feature at the top or put your question into the chat and I will get to them as I go along. So with that, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Carson Gorecki. I am the Regional Labor Market Analyst for Northeast Minnesota for the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And this morning, you are attending the latest in Northeast Minnesota's labor market. It's an update on the trends and characteristics of the labor market in Northeast Minnesota, which is Aiken, Carlton, Cook, Itasca, Lake, Koochiching, and St. Louis counties. What is a labor market information? Well, labor market information can take many forms. You're probably most familiar with labor market information in the form of unemployment rates and employment or jobs data that are released every month, both nationally, but then also by our state labor market information office. There are state labor market information offices in all 50 states throughout the country. And we serve as points of contact for those data I mentioned, as well as wages and salaries, job projections by industry and occupation, graduate employment outcomes for high school and post-secondary, and a whole host of other information that connects people and the economy. I mentioned points of contact. The Labor Market Information Office serves as that, but us regional analysts, and there are 6 of us throughout the state, are meant to be local points of contact, more in touch with the local economies or the regional economies throughout the state, and we were all located in our region. So I am talking to you today from downtown Duluth, and you can see all of my colleagues throughout the state. So if you have any interest in getting information in those other regions, you now know your expert in your local area. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to start really broad. We're going to start with population. We're going to talk about the labor force, some latest trends in unemployment and labor force. We're going to touch on industry, employment, occupational employment, and demographics, and a few other things that I thought was super interesting and important for people to know. It looks like we've got a good mix of folks working in workforce development, chambers of commerce, economic development, and other state agencies, and even maybe a few private industry or employers here. But the great thing about labor market information is that everyone can use it to make sound decisions. So let's kick it off. Starting most broadly, population growth. has been notable. Like, there has been population growth, and that has been notable given the long-term trend of the region, which has been a lot more variable. Since 2020, Northeast Minnesota has added 1,500 people, but only 950 since 2010. So it's been a little bit up and down. Both of those changes are a little bit less than 0.5%. If we break that out by sub-area or county and city within the region, you can see that Aiken is the only county in the region that grew faster than the state over that 2020 to 24 period, adding 638 people. It's a relatively small county, but that is good enough for 4%. Also growing were Carlton County, the city of Duluth, and Itasca County. St. Louis County also was growing slightly. But if you go outside of there, Cook and Lake and Couchiching up to our north end of the region saw population decline over those 4 years. By comparison, the U.S. grew 2.5%. Within the population, by age and age cohort, it is important to know how those are changing as well, because as the population changes and as the ages and age groups change and add and subtract, so we'll reflect that we will reflect that in the labor force. So by age, these are the changes we have seen in the region over the last 4 or so years. Again, overall population grew, but our youngest population, 17 and younger, actually declined over that period. Where we saw the growth was in 18 to 24, and that is, college age or right after high school age. We do have a lot of post-secondary institutions in the region that draw a lot of that cohort. We did add in what we call the prime workforce years, the 25 to 44. So that's like the prime working years. So we did add about 1,600 folks in that age group, which is great for the labor market. However, we lost about 6,000 people in the 45 to 64. So that's kind of late career folks. That was where we saw the largest relative decline over the last 4 years. And then we added 7,000 or more than 7,000 65 plus folks. And that reflects the larger trend of aging population in the region. And that gets us to where we are here on the blue side of the chart. That is our population pyramid, with the oldest age groups being at the bottom by share of population. So you can see we have a larger bulge or a larger share of the population in that 55 plus age group or age groups relative to the state. That reflects our older population. I'll also point out that we do have a larger share in that 15 to 24 population, again, reflecting the presence of those strong educational institutions. So looking at the longer term, over the last 24 years, we added 35,000 or about 36,000 55 plus residents, and correspondingly saw a decline of about 31,000 in the 54 and under residents. So a big demographic switch has been happening over the last couple decades, and we're really seeing that around that retirement age. So I'll touch on that again a little bit more. And then the final point about the age of the region is that when you measure by median age, so that's half the population is older than this age and half the population is younger. Northeast Minnesota had a median age of 48, and that's about 10 years older than the median age of the state. And when you break that out by county, we have 4 of the 6 oldest median ages or oldest counties in the state. Aiken is the oldest, Cook is number 2, and then I think Couchiching and Itasca are also on the top 6. When we talk about population, we also talk about how different components of population change. Since 2020, Northeast Minnesota has had 5,100 more deaths and births. So if there was nobody moving in or out of the region, we would have just declined by 5,100. But fortunately for Northeast Minnesota, we have seen positive in-migration or net positive migration over the last 4 years especially. You can see the annual net trend here. Prior to 2020, it was a bit mixed bag, up and down. and international migration is in the orange part of those bars, and then domestic being from other parts of the US in the blue bars. We saw pretty notable increases following 2020 in both domestic and international, and the international share actually grew over those 4 years as well. We did see a decline into 2024, however, but the net positive migration is what is sustaining the population growth that we have seen over the last 4 years. Excuse me. A little bit more on population characteristics by race and ethnicity. We are less racially and ethnically diverse in Northeast Minnesota than compared to the rest of the state. However, the population of color is growing rapidly, relatively. While the white population declined over the decade from 2013 to 2023, the people of color population grew 30%. So almost all of the growth we have seen over the last decade can be attributable to growth in groups of color. When we look at the foreign-born population, it's relatively small, a little under 6,000 people in the region as of last estimate. That equates to about 1.8%. And based off of place of origin, this is the breakdown essentially by what continent they were born in. Pretty even split between the Americas, Europe, and Asia, all around 25 to 30%. Smaller shares from Oceania, Pacific Islands, and Africa. I will say compared to the state, our foreign-born population entered earlier. So I like to say that they have been more established in the region despite being smaller. We also have a larger share of our population with a high school or equivalent, high school diploma or equivalent, talking about educational attainment, some college or associate degree. So either started college, is still in college, or chose not to finish, or have an associate degree. And that reflects more of the blue collar workforce that we have in Northeast Minnesota relative to the state. We'll end the population section with a little bit on projections. So looking into the future, what do we expect the population to do? Minnesota's State Demographic Center projects population to actually decline over the next 2 decades into 2045. We're expecting to lose about 17,000 people out of the 325,000 that we have currently, or 327,000 currently. And that is at the same time happening while the state expects to grow over those 2 decades. A lot of that is going to reflect the trends of the last couple decades, especially aging. But what it may not fully capture is that recent net positive migration that I showed you a couple of slides ago. These projections were calculated kind of in the middle of that, so they might not capture the full impact of that trend. So when the next projections are produced and released, I expect the decline to either be smaller or to be completely gone, and us to actually have slight population growth projections. I'll pause there to see if we have any questions in the chat. Looks like none so far. All right, we're going to dive into the labor force trends and characteristics next. So when I talk about the labor force, I have a very specific definition that I'm referring to. The blue line here represents the number of people in Northeast Minnesota that are either working, so actively employed, or if they're not working, they are actively looking for work. So that is the definition, or the most common definition of unemployment is not working, but having looked for work in the last month. So that is what the blue line represents in terms of labor force, and then the gray bars in unemployment rate represents the share of folks on average in that year that have looked for work in the last month. When you see the unemployment rate published in the news, that is typically what they're referring to in terms of unemployment rate. But actually, there are a bunch of other ways to define unemployment. I'm not going to get into that in this presentation, but if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd be happy to talk to you. Since 2020, when we had spikes in unemployment and a drop in labor force, we have seen the labor force rebound almost fully to where it was pre-COVID. Still a little bit short in terms of absolute count of folks in the labor force. We did have historically low unemployment for several years following 2020. But we are starting to reach back to where we were in terms of unemployment before the pandemic, 4.7% average through the end of 2025, not including October when the federal shutdown happened and we didn't have data for that month, and not including December, which we do not have data for until next week. Across the state, this is the spatial trend of unemployment as of November of last year. You can see Northeast Minnesota has higher unemployment relative to the rest of the state. That is a historic trend. We tend to see higher unemployment in Northeast Minnesota. A lot of that can be attributable to the more seasonal employment. We have a higher share of jobs in seasonal industries like construction, leisure, and hospitality, most notably. And unemployment insurance claims, which we have data for as well. This is slightly different from unemployment. Unemployment, as we talked about in the previous slide, is based off of a survey. Unemployment insurance claims are from folks that are actually filing those claims with the state. So we have administrative data. And just because you're unemployed does not mean that you are filing unemployment insurance claims. So just to make sure that we have those two definitions correct. We have initial claims data, which is for the first claim that someone has filed after they are laid off. And this is the trend in Northeast Minnesota for initial claims over the last 20 or so, 25 years. You could see 2020 jump out very starkly when we had a spike in layoffs and unemployment. But since then, we actually have had lower numbers of initial claims on average in each year since. And this is for, again, November of 2025. So this is comparing to all the past Novembers. So it's actually the lowest count in November in this whole series, other than in 2022, when we had a historically tight labor market. We also have data for what we call regular continued claims. So these are claims filed more than just that initial claim. So if you are filing for multiple weeks, you'll be counted in the regular continued claims. And what this is showing here is by month, the number of claims filed in Northeast Minnesota. The gray bar will be 2025 months. And the trend I'll point out here is that the gray bar is higher in most of those months compared to the previous years in 2019, other than in November, which we have the last data for. In November, we actually saw lower regular continued claims compared to the previous years in Northeast Minnesota. So our initial claims are down compared to previous years, and our regular claims are down compared to previous years. All that despite our unemployment rate going up. So there are folks that may be unemployed that, for whatever reason, are not filing claims yet, and that is not too atypical. There are people that may think that, oh, this unemployment spell is, not very long, so I'm not going to file claims just yet. I expect to be employed shortly. But if you look at the previous months, if I was doing this presentation a month ago, we would just have the October data, and then that would be almost a completely different takeaway. It'd be like regular continued claims have been up for the last several months, and that is an indication of longer-term unemployment or higher longer-term unemployment. So we'll look to see what the subsequent months show, but November was kind of a changing of the trend of the last several months. Unemployment claims were up the most for mining. It's probably no surprise. The mining layoffs are big news in the region, and they definitely played a role in increasing overall claims. When you add 300, 400 claims, that meant that mining initial claims back when they started to hit the data, we're up 2,000%, and they continue to be up about 2,000%. So that's comparing like 315 claims to 10 claims that were filed in November of 2024. Educational services and management and info were also up for initial claims, and then regular claims were also up for people with bachelor's or more advanced degrees. And our Black or African American workers and our oldest workers saw regular claims up over the year. I oftentimes will use the term tight or loose to describe the labor market. And that can have a lot of different meanings depending on the context. But when I'm talking about it here specifically, I'm referring to the ratio or the relationship between job seekers, so the number of people who are unemployed and looking for work, and the number of job vacancies that are available. So when we divide the job seekers into job vacancies, we get a ratio, which is represented here in the black dots. And you can see that back in the Great Recession, we had 11 job seekers for every single job opening. And that has declined almost consistently without any change other than in 2020 to below 1, even before 2020. So below 1 means that there's fewer people looking for work than there are jobs available, and that is an indication of a tight labor market. And that had been the case for several years, excepting 2020, and continued to be the case in 2024. However, we're starting to see some indication of loosening of the labor market as the number of job openings statewide have been declining. And as I showed you earlier, the number of unemployed folks has been growing. So there are signs both nationally, statewide, and locally that the labor market is starting to loosen a bit. That, of course, will vary depending on specific location, so like city, and by industry. Some industries are still hiring and still in very much need of workers. Others are less so. Think about mining as an example. Labor force participation is simply the share of the people who are eligible to be working, so 16 or older, not institutionalized in prison or whatever, that are either working or unemployed and actively looking for work. So in Northeast Minnesota, this is lower, much lower than it is for the rest of the state, the labor force participation rate. You can see here that, which represents the area out of the city of Duluth in Northeast Minnesota, the labor force participation rate was 57%. Duluth was higher at 66%, but both areas were lower than the state average and among the lowest in the state. And this is the case when you look at all of the different demographic categories as well. So if you compare labor force participation across age, race, ethnicity, ability, veteran status, educational attainment, Northeast Minnesota has lower labor force participation rates across all of those categories. There's not a single exception. It's pretty remarkable, and it points to something other than the typical factors that impact labor force participation, which the biggest one being age. As you are older, over 65, labor force participation tends to decline quite dramatically. I'll point out here with my handy laser pointer. You can see here, 65 to 74, you only got about 20% of the population there engaged in the labor force, and then 5.2% 75 years or older. It's not typical to see that decline after the typical retirement age of around 65, but I'll point out relative to the state, it is still lower in Northeast Minnesota. And then when you compare across race and ethnic categories, you have the same thing. And then when you add in those other categories I talked about, it's the same case. Lower for those with less than a high school diploma, lower for those with bachelor's degree or higher, although less so, but lower labor force participation across all these different categories, which is really something remarkable and unique to Northeast Minnesota. Within the region, we also have some disparities. Largest for the 65 plus workers that I mentioned, our Black, our African American workers, our Indigenous workers, workers with disabilities, and those with less than a high school diploma. That's the groups that are seeing the largest, even within our region of low labor force participation. Those are the groups that we're seeing even lower labor force participation relative to that. So those are the groups that are seeing the barriers keeping them out of the workforce more so relative to some of their neighbors. Taking those characteristics in mind, and then also factoring the labor, the population change that we talked about previously, we can also do an estimation of what the labor force is going to look like over the next several years. And this is assuming that labor force participation will hold steady for those groups. So aging will definitely play a role in the projected labor force over the next 10 years. So we're expected to see a decline of about 2,200 people in Northeast Minnesota engaged in the workforce. At the same time, Minnesota is expected to add about 95,000 workers to grow about 3%. So heading different directions, Northeast Minnesota versus Minnesota. Breaking that out by age group, you can really see where the changes are occurring. We see those losses in our younger workforce, those that are kind of the emerging workforce, we call it, so under 25, projected declines, a small increase in the 25 to 44 prime workforce group. That is especially notable. Only 87 is essentially a flat, or 0.1% is essentially flat. That is the largest age group here. So to only see 87% people projected to be added is notable. However, we are seeing projected growth in the 45 to 54 age group workforce, and then declines in the 55 plus to 74, with a small increase in the 75 years and over. I'll say that that increase in the 75 years and over, relatively small in overall number, and that just has to do with the overall aging of our population. There's just going to be a lot more older people, and even if the same or even a smaller share of those folks opt to work, it's a share of a much larger group, and that's why we're going to see some growth there. Transition a little bit to housing, which definitely has been impacting the labor market. If there's not housing available, workers cannot move to where the job is. I've heard anecdotes over and over again of employers agreeing to hire somebody only to have them, the candidate, pull out because they are not able to find adequate housing in the region. So that is definitely impacting the labor market. The same can be said for childcare. I just want to point out a few high-level trends in the housing market. We have low supply, and we have low vacancy rates. So this is just showing the vacancy rates here by homeowner and rental. So less than 1% as of last estimate for rental homeowner vacancy rates. A little bit higher for rental, but definitely hard to find housing. But at the same time, we also have not very low, but relatively low occupancy. So Northeast Minnesota, a playground for a lot of the state. And as a result, we have a lot of second homes and cabins. So we have a lot of homes that are not used for a good chunk of the year, and those are deemed to be unoccupied because the primary housing unit for those folks is elsewhere outside of the region. So we have an occupancy rate of, or a vacancy rate of about 23% overall housing units, and that's much higher than the 9.4% statewide. And that is out of our estimated about 180,000 housing units in the region. At the same time, also adding to the inaccessibility is rising costs. So the median sales price of $275,000 most recently is up 6% over the year and up 37% over 5 years. And 42% of renters, just showing the impact of housing costs, 42% of renters are spending more than 35% of their income, household income, on housing or on housing costs, and then 15% of homeowners. So less impactful of homeowners, but definitely squeezing a lot of our renters in the region as well. And then lastly, our older housing stock. We have older housing stock relative to the rest of the state, and that means increased housing costs as well relative to maintenance. So just showing you the median sales price trend from Lake Superior, from Minnesota Realtors. So you can see how it's just grown steadily over the last 5 years. Still cheaper than the rest of the state, but growing. And then the Atlanta Federal Reserve published this handy chart that compares in the Duluth Metro the actual median income. That's the blue line. So that's been growing. However, the income needed to qualify for the median sales price or priced home has been rising more rapidly, and that's what the orange line represents. You can see just in the last year and a half or so, that has started to be above the median income. So largely unaffordable for the median worker in the region. All right, I'll take another little pause here, see if we have any questions. Looks like maybe in the Q&A. Okay, maybe I missed it. Could you please explain how the employment projection is estimated and what assumptions are used in developing it? Yes, thank you for that question. Those employment projections are largely based off of past trends in related industries. So basically a regression is run with some related variables, just to get into the weeds a little bit. So labor force trends will affect that. So if you don't have workers available, like that's going to constrain employment growth across a lot of industries. How has that industry changed in the last 5 to 10 years is probably the biggest variable in how those employment projections are estimated. But it varies from industry to industry in terms of yeah, related industries as well. So those are kind of the main things that go into creating those employment projections. But I'm happy to delve into the methodology in more detail after the presentation. So thank you for that question. Right. I'm going to jump into industry employment and wage trends. All right. Overall, looking at Northeast Minnesota overall employment over the last 25 years, this is the employment trend. Again, you can see the impacts of the Great Recession in 2009, 2010, but then especially in 2020. Northeast Minnesota has not recovered from the pandemic impacts quite yet. We haven't reached those pre-pandemic levels of employment. The state has since then. We are down 4,600 jobs from 2019, but we have also gained about 7,200 since 2020. So it's been pretty strong growth. 2025 only includes Q1 and Q2. So the employment there doesn't represent the whole year. So you see the decline there. That might not actually be the case when we factor in the Q3 and Q4 data. So just keep that in mind. But you can see 4 years of strong employment growth, but still not back to where we were after 1 year of about 15% decline in employment. Sorry, about 10% decline in employment. Over the last decade, if you look a bit longer term, we're down about 3,600 jobs. Breaking those overall employment numbers down by industry, we have 5 sectors that account for about 2/3 of total employment in the region. They include healthcare and social assistance, retail, trade, accommodation, food services, educational services, and public administration, i.e. government. And combined, they account for 63% of all jobs. Healthcare alone accounts for about 1 out of every 4 jobs in the region. So the biggest sector by almost double. So the next largest is retail trade, accounting for about 12% of jobs. Accommodation, food services accounting for another 10% of jobs. The fastest growing over the last decade have been manufacturing, professional, scientific, and technical services, which includes architecture, engineering, computing, design services, and consulting. Construction sector also has been fast growing, and public administration. So you can see the 2 different periods of growth that I've kind of put here to measure against the last decade from 2015 to 2024, 2025, and then over the last year from Q2 2024 to Q2 2025. Some sectors like information have seen long-term declines continue, while some others have actually flipped. So professional scientific services, if you look at over the decade, has been growing, but more recently has seen declines. Another one that kind of switched is educational services, which over the longer term has been declining, but has grown more recently. And then healthcare and social assistance has kind of just been plugging away with above average growth in both those terms. One way to measure competitive advantage or how concentrated an industry is to compare the number or share of jobs in a sector in our region relative to that share of jobs statewide. And from that, we get what is called location quotient. And if we calculate the location quotients for the main industry sectors in Northeast Minnesota, we can see where we are most concentrated in our employment. Mining, employment is 15 times more concentrated in Northeast Minnesota than it is relative to the rest of the state. That might not be a surprise for anybody that works and lives in the region. That concentration may be down slightly with the recent layoffs. But in second place, in terms of concentration, we have utilities sector, followed by public administration, arts and entertainment and recreation, healthcare and social assistance, accommodation food services, retail trade, other services, and construction. All have above average concentration in Northeast Minnesota. At the other end, where we have less concentration, management of companies, that'll largely be like headquarters. We don't have a huge concentration of those establishments. In employment, wholesale trade, architecture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. I'll point out that we do have high concentration of fishing, hunting, and forestry, but it's that more traditional agriculture, crop agriculture that we have much less of in Northeast Minnesota, and that's why we have less than 1 location quotient for that sector. I'll also point out that educational services is about 1 in Northeast Minnesota. In Duluth, it is higher, where we have several of those educational institutions like UMD, St. Scholastica, Lake Superior College located. Then another way to show the concentration is via tree map. I just like these charts. I think they're kind of handy. I'm a kind of a visual learner and understander. So this is showing the same thing as the last chart, but just in a different way. The dark red represents the most concentration, and then the size of the square represents total employment. Wages is another very crucial component that we keep an eye on by industry and occupation. The big takeaway here is that wage growth that had been pretty strong for several years in a row has stalled out recently. The highest paying, the blue line here in the chart here is the Duluth Metro, and it's compared to other areas of the state, notably the metro area, statewide, and then US. You can see that we had been keeping pace with US earnings for the last several years, and then just recently actually stalled out. That stall corresponds almost exactly with the mining layoffs we had. So it turns out if you lose about 300 to 400 of the highest paying jobs in the region, you're going to see that impact in the average wage and earnings data. And that is indeed the case. Mining is the second highest paying sector on average. Utilities just eked out mining at 118,000 average wage, annual wage. At the other end of the spectrum, accommodation, food services, arts, entertainment, recreation, other services. Other services largely will be like laundry, salons, death services, kind of a catch-all for some of these industries, but relatively low paying. Retail trade is also under $40,000 on average. The overall average for all wages and all industries in the region is just under $60,000 as of the 4 quarters ending in Q2 2025. But you could see that some of our largest industries, such as public administration, healthcare, are above average in their pay. Over the last year, wages grew 1.5%. That was through Q2 2025. The data on the previous slide here are monthly, so we have a little bit more recent data. So that Q2 2025, I anticipate that Q3, if you're to do over the year change there, it's going to be a little bit different story. Fastest growing wages happened in agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, real estate, rental, administrative support, and notably manufacturing. We put together employment trends, concentration, and wages, and you get a good idea of the impacts that different sectors have in the region. So which of the sectors are paying above average wages, above average concentration, and growing? You get healthcare and social assistance, public administration, construction, educational services, and utilities. There's asterisks next to educational services and utilities because Those have been growing more recently, but if you look over the decade, which is what I initially did to do the growing measurement, they were more flat. But I made an exception to include them just because they are growing over the last 5 years. Concentrated in high wages, mining, but not growing. High wages and growing, manufacturing, professional scientific and technical services. They're not concentrated relatively in the region. There are subsectors like transportation equipment manufacturing. Think about Cirrus that have been growing very rapidly and are very concentrated in the region. However, not concentrated at the sector level. Concentrated in growing leisure and hospitality. Very important sector to the region, but do not pay high wages on average. All right, so I was mostly looking at it from the industry perspective. So that's what the business does. Occupations focus on what the actual workers do. So we have data reflecting employment and wages for occupations and occupational groups as well in Northeast Minnesota. You see some similar trends to industries, but if you think about, for example, accountants can work across, it's one occupation that can work across all industries. That's just one example. You think about nurses tend to be an occupation that work almost solely in healthcare. 46% of employment are in 4 occupational groups. At the top here, you've got office administrative support, food prep and serving related, sales and related, and healthcare practitioners and technical. Put those all together, and they account for almost half of total employment. Again, reflecting the concentration of leisure and hospitality industries and healthcare and social assistance. The highest paying occupational groups are management, which is relatively small, architecture and engineering, legal, and healthcare practitioners. Healthcare practitioners will include doctors, nurse practitioners, registered nurses, etc. The lowest paying occupational groups in the region are food prep and serving related, sales, and personal care. Those again really correspond with those relatively low paying industries in leisure hospitality and personal care services or other services. Most concentrated occupations using that same method as we did for industries, farming, fishing, and forestry, community services, and construction and extraction, largely due to the presence of mining in the region. On the other end, least concentration happens in computer and math, legal, production, and business and financial operations. Occupations in demand is another really important component that we track in the region. And we have a pretty good diversity of types of jobs that are in demand in the region. We can break it out by the typical education attainment required for to enter an occupation. So that's what it's organized by here. The occupational groups that stand out are, of course, healthcare. There are a lot of occupations listed here at the highest demand that are in the healthcare practitioner or healthcare support occupational groups. But you also have some good representation of general business support and education, among others. Service, I will point out, is highly represented in some of the lower educational requirement categories, as well as in the higher educational requirement categories. I'll point out that there are more than 70 occupations on my last estimation in Northeast Minnesota that are in demand, do not require post-secondary education or training, and pay wages that are above the regional median. What does our workforce look like? This is also super important to track because it's not the same across industries, and it has been changing, reflecting our changing workforce. Northeast Minnesota, as the population has a slightly older workforce when you compare it to Minnesota. Our youngest workers tend to be in leisure and hospitality and retail sectors. That makes sense. There's a lot more part-time jobs and opportunities available in those sectors. And those are traditionally where young workers, especially teens, end up being employed. Think about those summer type of jobs. Oldest workers are more present in agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, as well as real estate. And then employment in the oldest and youngest age groups has been growing. So we've seen growth at kind of the ends of the age spectrum in our workforce. And to show that, here is the change over the last 5-6 years, both numerically and percent change by age, but then as well over the last decade. And you can see, so take 14 to 18 year old workforce, for example, 33% growth in the number of workers there and teenage workers in the region. So a lot of folks have taken advantage of the increased employment opportunities and tight labor market that we've been seeing over the last several years, and young people have kind of been the primary beneficiaries of that. And a lot of that growth has happened recently. Same can be said for the opposite trend. So 55 to 64-year-olds, you've seen the largest declines, and most of that decline has happened recently in the last 5 years. You can see 20% decline. I've lost about 5,600 of those workers, which is super interesting. Like, those were the workers that left during the pandemic. Think about people who had retirement savings set up, they could leave the workforce. They did not return. The 65 plus workers that were working and still engaged in the workforce may have left as a result of COVID, but they came back. So those are people who either had to work for financial reasons or really just wanted to keep working. A little bit more on employment demographics. Our workforce, reflecting our population and labor force, is mostly white, but reflecting the population changes is diversifying. Most of the employment gains over the last decade, 5-10 years, have been from workers of color, or employment of color. So employment of color grew 21% since 2015. That's about 2,400 additional workers, and up 3% from 2019. So it slowed a little bit, but that is reflecting the larger slowdown in employment growth. At the same time, white employment has declined. The fastest growing groups have been Hispanic or Latino, growing 45% since 2015, two or more races up 30%, and Black or African American workers up 23%. You can see how this change has occurred over time, from 2010 low end of the chart to 24, 25 at the top end. High school and post-secondary graduate outcomes. I like to keep track of this because this represents our emerging workforce, who is going to be the workforce of the future, our high schoolers and our college students, because a lot of them do stay in the region and are employed in the region. So from a statewide longitudinal education data system, or SLEDs, we have these great data. The orange line here represents the share of Minnesota high school grads that are enrolled in college following graduation. And then the blue line represents the Northeast Minnesota share. So we have a lower share that attend post-secondary relative to the state, and that has been declining over time, as has the absolute number. But I will point out, since 2021, we have seen, more of a mixed trend. It hasn't been pure decline that we've been seeing the decade before that. We actually saw growth from 2023 into 2024, both in number and share attending college. If we look into that in a little more detail, you can see that Northeast Minnesota grads, high school grads, are more likely to attend two-year public schools. We think about the great institutions present in the region, like Minnesota North, Lake Superior College, Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. A lot of those are great draws for our high school grads. So having that located in the region will serve to keep a lot of those grads in the region. So they're great assets. We have 41% of our graduates that attend post-secondary choosing those two-year colleges, and a lot of them are those two-year colleges in the region. The top attended are Minnesota North, Lake Superior College, UMD, University of Minnesota Twin Cities, St. Scholastica, and then UND, North Dakota, is the 5th ranked most popular destination. We also can tell if a graduate chooses to work right away or just work, and we have a higher share of those graduates in Northeast Minnesota as well. So more of our graduates see employment opportunities and pursue those in the region right away after graduating. And this is showing post-secondary graduates from local institutions where they end up working. So we can track graduates to see where they are employed by industry, but also by region. And depending on the type of school or school that they attend, there's pretty varied outcomes in terms of geographic location. So for example, 35% of the estimated 10,000 or so graduates between 2019 and 2023 from the post-secondary institutions in Northeast Minnesota, about a third of them ended up working in Northeast Minnesota 2 years later after graduation. But if you look at LSC, like Superior College, that share is much higher. And then UMD and St. Scholastica much lower. Part of that has to do where those students come from initially. We bring in a lot more students to St. Scholastica and UMD from outside the region. A lot of those students opt to return to where they came from after graduation, whereas a lot of the students that attend Minnesota North, Lake Superior College, and Fond du Lac come from the region to begin with and hope to stay in the region post-graduation. Most of the businesses in Northeast Minnesota, maybe not surprising to you, are small businesses. Over half of the employment is at businesses with fewer than 100 workers, and 15% is at businesses, 15% of total employment in the region is at businesses with more than 500 workers, or large businesses. At the same time, self-employment has been growing quite rapidly. In Northeast Minnesota, 8.6% 8.6% growth over the last decade. That's slower than the state overall, but this represents the huge growth in, say, gig work. When you look at the different industries that make up self-employment, you see the fastest growth in transportation warehousing. Think about Uber, Amazon delivery. They're not technically employed by those companies. They're self-employed. We're seeing a lot of growth as a result of that in self-employment. We also publish employment projections, which I talked about earlier a little bit. Just ending with some of the latest industry projections. I will note that we do these on 2-year cycles, and we are about to work on calculating the 2024 to 2034 projections. So stay tuned for an update to these. But as of these projections, we're forecasting to add about 5,200 jobs over the next 10 years. Most of those jobs expected to be added in healthcare, social assistance, accommodation, food services, and construction. Healthcare and leisure and hospitality are really kind of core sectors in this region, so that is no surprise. Declines for some industries that have seen long-term declines, like information, or transitions such as e-commerce and automation, and energy. Utilities here was actually projected to see a little bit of a decline, but given huge growth in AI and electricity demand, I fully expect that to be reflected positively in employment projections for the next round. And then, if I can click. By occupation, see some of the same trends, leisure and hospitality, so food prep and serving related, up at the top in terms of number of openings. And these openings can be created several ways, either from turnover or from new jobs added. The bulk of the jobs that are going to be open are from turnover, so either from people leaving the labor force, so labor force exit openings, or from leaving that occupation to go to another type of job. And because that is such a large occupational group, we are going to see a lot of demand in those occupations, even if overall the number of jobs is going to decline. Say like an office admin support, as we see automation, AI impacting that workforce, there's still a lot of jobs there to be had and to be filled. Some of the fastest or biggest jobs, this is kind of more detailed version of that previous chart, just showing the number of openings projected by individual occupation over the next 10 years in Northeast Minnesota. At the top, you'll see fast food counter workers and cashiers. Cashiers, actually, the number of them is projected to decline, but given that there have been so many of them, that still is going to be a job that'll be in demand just due to the sheer volume of jobs. Same thing with retail salespeople. All right, got about 5 minutes left, so wrapping up. The slow population growth has been sustained largely by migration and projected population decline despite that recent growth because of that migration. We'll see how the next round of population projections incorporate the more recent trends. But as the population continues to age, which is a big component of those population decline projections, we expect to see the aging of the population to impact our labor force as well. We have had some recent growth, but long-term decline. The aging of our population is most likely going to be a drag on labor force numbers and participation. The recent employment growth, nonetheless, despite all these headwinds in population, labor force, and kind of overall uncertainty, the COVID deficit remains for many of our areas. And some of the key sectors in the region, many that have been performing well, include healthcare and social assistance, public administration, construction, educational services, utilities, mining, manufacturing, and leisure and hospitality. So we'll keep an eye on how those fare in the near and long term. And I will wrap it up with just say thank you for this hour of your morning. I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope this is helpful for setting the context for you and your roles. And just know that we are resources for you in your role. We can help you answer those questions or help you find data that may be not so easy to navigate. I can understand that our website and the census website is not necessarily straightforward. So we're here to help you find what you need to answer those questions. So I'll pause there and open up for any questions. But if you got to take off, you get 5 minutes back. And thank you for your hour.